The sky, over Saipan, was gray and trembling, thick with smoke from burned palm trunks. It was the summer of 1944, and the sound of engines had faded. Only the wind and the soft shuffle of feet remained. 350 Japanese women, mostly nurses and civilian aides, stood barefoot in a line that snaked through the ruins of a military outpost. The ash still glowed faintly. American soldiers shouted for order, rifles angled downward but ready. Someone coughed. Someone else prayed in whispers. Then came the order: move forward. The first step hit like lightning. The ash wasn't just warm, it was alive, biting through skin. A woman stumbled and left half her footprint smoking behind her. The others hesitated, eyes darting toward the Americans, who stood unmoved. Go, one shouted again. The prisoners moved as one trembling body, their white uniforms already streaked with soot. Every second felt stretched, like time itself refused to watch what was happening. Inside one soldier's head, confusion gnawed. This wasn't in the manual. These weren't fighters. They were nurses, the ones who had once treated wounded men on the other side. But the command had been clear. No exceptions, no delays. Discipline over sympathy. And so he watched, boots planted on cooler ground, as the women's feet sank deeper into that black river of pain. Reports from the field would later describe controlled passage over post-combat debris. The words hid everything: the smell of burning flesh, the wet hiss of blood meeting embers, the sound of muffled cries. The temperature of the ground was estimated above 120 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt leather. But there was no leather here, only skin. Among the women, one whispered in disbelief, "We expected death, not this kind of pain." Her voice carried, thin and sharp, across the line. For a heartbeat, even the guards froze. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, a reminder that hell had many shapes. And this was just one of them. When the last woman crossed the patch of burning ground, silence took over again. Smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of salt and skin into the humid air. They had made it through, but the march wasn't over. The real agony was only beginning. Buried under their blistered feet waiting to surface, the march didn't end when the line cleared the burning patch. It followed them, clinging to their bodies, creeping under their skin. The women huddled near a shattered airstrip, the ground still pulsing with heat. Steam rose from their ankles like ghosts leaving the earth. One of them, a young nurse named Haruko, bit into her sleeve to stop herself from screaming. The fabric darkened with blood and sweat around her. Others tried to scrape ash off their feet with metal canteen lids. It only made things worse. Skin peeled like wet paper. An American medic stood nearby, holding a clipboard instead of a bandage. He'd been told to observe for medical records, no treatment without orders. The air smelled of burned hair and sea salt. "Keep them moving," a sergeant barked. "They'll stiffen up if they sit too long." The medic looked down at Haruko. Her eyes met his, glassy and hollow, like someone who had already gone somewhere far away. The temperature of the ash, recorded later in a field note, was over 120 degrees Celsius. A single step meant second-degree burns. 2 steps meant third-degree. Every heartbeat pumped more pain through their bodies. One soldier muttered. They said, "We were the civilized ones." But no one answered. Silence was safer than doubt. Haruko whispered something in Japanese. No one understood. Then she said it again, in broken English, barely audible. "Why?" Her question floated between the smoke and the stairs. The answer never came. Orders had no room for mercy. And still, the contradiction stung. The Americans had been told they were liberators, bringing justice to the Pacific. Yet here they stood, watching women burn not from gunfire, but from obedience. A few tried to pour canteen water over their feet, but the guards slapped the bottles away. The liquid hissed as it hit the ash. Someone vomited from the smell. The medic clenched his fists. He wanted to walk away but couldn't. His duty wasn't to feel, it was to document. As the sun dipped lower, the women were forced to march again, leaving footprints of blood and cinder. Their pain turned inward, deeper than flesh, eating into faith itself. And that question echoed louder than the ocean behind them by nightfall. The smoke had thinned, but the air was still thick with orders. The American officer in charge, Lieutenant Harris, stood near a jeep, radio pressed to his ear. Static, mixed with the sound of coughing prisoners. The voice on the other end was calm, bureaucratic, and cold. Confirmed decontamination protocol complete. Harris hesitated. His men were tired, the women barely standing. Still, he repeated the line word for word. Protocol complete. The truth was simpler and uglier. There had been no contamination. The march through burning ash wasn't medical procedure. It was punishment, disguised as regulation. One of the guards asked quietly, "Sir, are we sure about this?" Harris didn't look up. "We follow command, no exceptions." His words landed flat, but everyone heard the crack underneath. The army had procedures for prisoners of war, rules drafted in Geneva 15 years earlier. The Japanese Empire hadn't signed, but America had. That line between what's right and what's done blurred fast in tropical heat. A woman collapsed near the fence. Her feet were swollen like torn fruit, flesh gray from shock. The guard called for a medic, but the order came back the same. No direct aid without clearance. So they watched her shiver until her breathing evened out or stopped. No one checked. Later, Harris scribbled in his logbook, "One casualty due to exhaustion." He didn't write the rest, the part where he caught his reflection in the jeep window and didn't recognize the man looking back. The discipline that once felt clean now smelled like smoke and guilt. The prisoners' murmurs drifted through the camp. "We were not soldiers." In their eyes, one woman said softly. The words reached a corporal standing guard. He pretended not to hear. Still, her sentence stayed lodged in his mind, heavier than the rifle he carried. Night fell fast in Saipan. The guards moved under lantern light, counting heads, writing numbers, not names. Harris turned off his radio. For a moment, the silence felt like relief until another voice called out from the darkness, "She's not moving." The officer's hand tightened around his pistol. The next order would decide whether mercy still existed in this place or, if it had burned away with the ash. Dawn slid in like a blade. Gray light cutting through the tent seams, exposing blistered feet and trembling hands. The camp was silent, except for distant engines and the crackle of cooling debris. Then, a voice broke through the haze, soft, unsure, but clear enough to turn heads. "Please, water." Every guard froze. The sound came from a young nurse, maybe 22. Her uniform half-burned, face streaked with ash. She spoke English, broken, halting but English. Her name, later confirmed in records, was Aiko Nakamura, a Red Cross volunteer who'd studied medicine in Yokohama before the war. Now, her voice trembled as she tried again. "We, need, water." The syllables fell heavy on the dust. Words that carried the impossible weight of dignity amid ruin. A sergeant glanced toward Lieutenant Harris, waiting for a cue. None came. The men looked at each other, awkward, unsure whether compassion itself counted as disobedience. Aiko staggered closer, holding out a dented canteen. "Please," she whispered. The guards exchanged nervous smirks, not out of cruelty, but fear. Mercy had rules. Too much could look like weakness. "You're not allowed to talk," one soldier barked, more to himself than to her. Aiko flinched, but didn't step back. Her accent cracked through the air, like a reminder that these weren't faceless enemies. They were people who'd learned the same language from different teachers. At that moment, the medic from the previous day appeared. His name tag read J. Rowe. He hesitated, eyes flicking from her face to the ash-caked ground. One interpreter for over 100 prisoners. That's all they had on the island. Without translation, humanity got lost in command chains. Rowe swallowed hard, then whispered, "Wait here." The sergeant snapped, "Leave her, Doc. Orders." But Rowe didn't move. He watched Aiko sway, her lips gray from thirst. One wrong move could get him court-martialed. One right move could save her life. He chose silence on. Silence was its own kind of defiance, as Aiko sank to her knees. Ro's hand twitched toward his canteen. He didn't give it yet, but the moment cracked something open in him. Around them, the guards shifted uneasily, as if feeling the same fracture. And somewhere inside that fracture, something human began to breathe again. The morning heat came early, crawling through canvas tents and metal canteens. Medic J-Ro hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw ICO's burned feet, and heard that single word. Please. Orders said to maintain distance, to treat them as hostile non-combatants. But those words didn't fit the scene in front of him. Rows of women lying on cots made from stretchers, their bandages dark and sticky, the air reeking of charred flesh. Ro checked his supply kit. 12 morphine ampules remained, barely enough for his own wounded men. His superior had warned, no unauthorized doses. Every drop accounted for. But when he saw Aiko again, trembling and muttering in Japanese, that rule started to dissolve. He waited until the sergeant left to check the perimeter, then crouched beside her. Quiet, he whispered, pulling a small syringe from his pocket. Her eyes widened. For pain, he said softly. She nodded once. The needle slid in clean, and for a moment, her breathing slowed. Relief and temporary settled over her face like mist. Ro wiped the sweat from his forehead. If anyone asks, he muttered, I didn't do this. Later, when inventory was checked, 12 doses would become 0. His logbook would list field loss due to heat. Redacted lines would cover the truth. Outside, another soldier saw him kneeling but looked away. Nobody wanted to write a report that might stain their record. In that silence, humanity hid between fear and paperwork. Iko whispered in broken English, You, good man. Ro froze. He didn't feel like one. His hands shook. No, he said, under his breath. Just stupid. But she smiled anyway, an exhausted, fractured smile that reminded him this war wasn't about flags anymore. It was about moments like this. Tiny rebellions of decency. Reports later mentioned missing morphine, but no suspects. One witness remembered a medic showing unnecessary compassion. Yet that small act spread quietly, guards talking. Whispers of mercy among men trained for hardness. Ro knew punishment might come, but as he watched Aiko drift into shallow sleep, he realized the only real crime here was forgetting what it meant to care. And that memory, once awakened, couldn't be buried under any ash. By afternoon, whispers had become echoes. The missing morphine hadn't gone unnoticed. A supply officer, pencil-thin and humorless, counted each vial twice, then barked at his clerk. Find out who's been playing doctor. Within an hour, Lieutenant Harris had the report on his desk. 12 doses, gone. No paperwork, no explanation. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't tell the story either. The command tent smelled of gasoline and damp uniforms. Harris sat across from Ro, his voice low but sharp. You think you're saving them? You're risking all of us. Ro didn't answer. He could still feel the heat of ICO's skin under his hands, the sound of her breathing easing for the first time in days. Orders, Harris continued. No exceptions. That phrase, no exceptions, had become a kind of prayer among officers who feared losing control. In 1944, the U.S. Army's Pacific directives warned against unauthorized compassion, citing it as a threat to discipline. Even kindness had to be approved. Ro's act, though small, cracked the clean surface of military obedience. He wasn't punished formally, but something colder happened. Isolation. His name disappeared from the rotation list. Men stopped sitting with him at meals. The silence was the sentence. Aiko noticed the change first. When he walked past the holding area, the guard stiffened. She lowered her head, but whispered softly in Japanese a word that meant thank you. Ro didn't look back, but his jaw tightened. Compassion, it seemed, was contagious. And the command feared infection more than insubordination that night. A memo arrived from higher headquarters, reinforced discipline. No deviation tolerated. Harris read it twice, then burned it in an oil drum. He knew what it meant: no more water, no more aid, no more hesitation. They feared kindness more than disobedience. One guard later wrote in his diary, "Rowe sat outside his tent, watching smoke drift toward the stars. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, Iko and the other women lay in silence, feet wrapped in rags, faces turned toward the sea. The ash had cooled, but the memory hadn't. By dawn, new orders came down, increased labor detail. The medics' rebellion had ended, but its consequences were just beginning to spread. Asterisk. Night dropped over Saipan like a wet blanket, heavy, slow, and smelling of salt and blood. The ash that had burned their feet by day now cooled just enough to sting instead of sear. The Japanese women lay scattered across the ground, their shapes outlined by lantern light. Some whispered prayers, others just stared at the sky. Steam hissed faintly from their damp bandages each time a medic splashed salt water over raw skin. The war didn't sound like gunfire. Tonight, it sounded like breathing. Ragged and unsure, Lieutenant Harris made his rounds, boots crunching on cinders. He paused near the fence, where Iko sat upright, her knees hugged to her chest. Her uniform clung to her skin, streaked with soot. Behind him, Sergeant Cole muttered, "They'll freeze out here." Harris didn't respond. Orders said no tents for enemy prisoners. The Pacific air wasn't cold by standard measure, but 4 bodies stripped of blood and strength. It bit deep in a nearby tent. Rowe wrote quietly in his logbook. The ink bled slightly from sweat and humidity. He noted the basics wound status, supply counts, but between the lines, his guilt crawled. He knew most of these women wouldn't see morning. 47% of POW injuries untreated in first 24 hours. He scribbled from memory, a statistic that suddenly felt like an accusation. Outside, the sky cleared. Stars burned bright over the island's broken skeleton bomb craters. Half-sunk trucks, shattered palms. Iko looked up at them and whispered to the woman beside her. The stars looked colder than the ash. The other nurse didn't answer. Maybe she didn't hear. Maybe she'd already slipped into sleep or something quieter. Harris lit a cigarette, the flare briefly illuminating his face. For a heartbeat, he looked less like an officer and more like a man who'd lost his map. Smoke mixed with the ocean breeze, carrying the day's memories somewhere he couldn't follow. Far off, the horizon flickered with distant shellfire, maybe, or just the war, reminding them it was still awake. When Harris turned away, the first light of dawn began to stretch across the ash, painting the burned landscape silver. With it came the sound of boots, and an order barked across the field. Morning meant work. Asterisk, the first command of the new day, cracked through the camp like a whip. On your feet. The women stirred slowly, their bodies stiff, bandages fused to their wounds. The ash, now cool on the surface, still hid embers beneath. As they rose, smoke puffed up around their ankles, like the earth itself refused to let them go. The sun had barely lifted over the wrecked palm trees, yet the work had already begun. They were ordered to clear debris from a bombed-out supply depot, metal twisted like vines. The smell of burned oil thickened the air. Iko limped forward, clutching a wooden shovel with trembling hands. Each step was a small negotiation with pain. The guards didn't shout much anymore. They didn't need to. The silence of obedience had settled in. One soldier muttered, "They'll drop before lunch." But no one replied. 16 hours a day, that was the rhythm of forced labor recorded across Pacific prison camps. The heat rose fast, pushing the horizon into a shimmer. Ico's vision blurred. Her feet sank into the cinders, each step reopening burns that had barely begun to close. She leaned on another nurse for balance, whispering, "Pain is our breakfast." The line spread quietly through the women like a grim kind of humor. Even suffering had its rhythm now. Lieutenant Harris watched from a distance, cigarette in hand. The medic, Rowe, stood beside him, face tight, silent. Harris said, "Orders are to keep them moving. Roe's jaw flexed. They won't last the week. Then they'll be replaced, Harris said flatly. The words fell heavy. He hated how normal they sounded. By midday, blisters burst, leaving trails of blood across the black sand. The guards handed out no water, only more shovels. One woman collapsed. Another picked up her load without looking back. Compassion had become a private act, too dangerous to show. Aiko stumbled again, this time dropping her shovel. The sound echoed louder than a gunshot in that strange silence. Every head turned. The guard nearest her tightened his grip on his rifle. Aiko didn't reach for the shovel again. She just stood there, breathing hard. The wind lifting ash around her feet like smoke around a candle. And in that stillness, something began to shift. One heartbeat before defiance found its voice. Asterisk. For a second, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant hum of flies circling over scorched metal. Aiko stood still, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the horizon. Her shovel lay on the ash beside her boots. She didn't shout, didn't plead. She simply refused. That silence cut through the camp sharper than any scream. The other women froze mid-motion, tools dangling from trembling hands. Even the guards hesitated, unsure what to do when defiance came without noise. Lieutenant Harris felt the weight of the moment before he even looked up. One act of rebellion could spread faster than fire. "Pick it up," a guard barked. Aiko didn't move. Her face was blank, but her stance said everything. The man's knuckles whitened on his rifle. Another soldier muttered, "Just one step, sir, she's asking for it." Harris didn't answer. He saw the line forming between power and pity. And for the first time, he didn't know which side he was on. Statistically, less than 3% of female prisoners of war were ever recorded as insubordinate in the Pacific Theater. It wasn't because they agreed. It was because resistance usually ended in death. But this was different. No shouting, no strike, no chaos. Just a woman standing barefoot in the middle of hell, choosing not to move. The ash shifted in the breeze. Ico's burned feet left faint prints where she'd stood too long. One of the other nurses whispered her name, then fell silent when a guard raised his rifle. The sun glared off the weapon's barrel, blinding for a heartbeat. Harris raised his hand, pulled fire. His voice cracked slightly, half command, half plea. Time seemed to slow. Ico's chest rose and fell once, twice. Then, quietly, she said something in Japanese, just a few syllables. The interpreter, standing nearby, swallowed hard and translated under his breath. She says, "No more." Her silence was the loudest scream. No one knew what to do next. Harris's hand stayed raised. The soldiers shifted, uncertain. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. Somewhere behind them, the medic Roe took a step forward, eyes fixed on Aiko. Harris exhaled slowly and began walking toward her, the ground crunching under his boot. Lieutenant Harris walked slowly toward Aiko, boots crunching over cooled ash, every step heavier than the last. The guards stood frozen behind him, rifles half-raised, eyes darting for permission. The silence stretched so long it started to hum. Harris stopped just a few feet away. Ico's face was streaked with soot and dried blood, but her eyes were steady. No hatred, no fear, just exhaustion, so deep it looked like peace. For a long moment, no one spoke. Harris finally said, "You'll rest when I say," his voice cracked halfway through. Not from anger, but from something that felt dangerously close to shame. Aiko didn't blink. The wind tugged at her burned uniform, flapping against her skin. Behind them, Roe held his breath. Harris's mind flashed to the order from headquarters. No deviation tolerated. It had been drilled into him since the invasion command, before conscience. But looking at her now, he saw what the paperwork couldn't show. Human cost, bare and silent. He lowered his pistol. "Rest him," he said quietly, voice rough. "For now." The guards didn't understand. "Sir?" one asked. "You heard me," Harris repeated. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of authority, the kind that didn't need yelling. The rifles lowered. Iso's legs gave out. She sank to the ground, gasping, but still holding his gaze. For the first time since the island fell, Harris didn't feel like an officer. He felt like a man trying to unlearn war in real time. That moment one order of mercy would later appear in the unit log as temporary suspension due to weather. 2 hours of rest, just 2. But among the prisoners, it spread like rumor, like oxygen. She looked at him, Ro would recall years later, and he turned away. Maybe because he couldn't face her, or maybe because she'd already seen the truth in him before he did. The soldiers eased up slightly, one lighting a cigarette, another loosening his helmet strap. For the first time, the air didn't feel like punishment, but the quiet mercy couldn't last. As the sun dipped low, a messenger truck rolled into camp, carrying new orders from headquarters. The reprieve was over before anyone dared to hope it could stay. By evening, the camp had gone unnaturally still. The women sat in a semicircle near the supply tent, bandaged feet tucked beneath them, scraps of paper clutched in trembling hands. Lieutenant Harris had allowed a writing interval, officially for recall-taking, unofficially to keep morale from collapsing. Most had nothing to write on but ration wrappers, the backs of medical forms, or pieces of torn cigarette cartons. The pencils were dull, the ink diluted with tears, but still, they wrote. Ico's handwriting was jagged, her fingers still stiff from burns. She began in Japanese, then switched clumsily to English. I am alive, but my feet are gone. She wasn't exaggerating. Several of her toes had fused from infection. Around her, the other nurses wrote fragments. Mother, the ocean smells different here. We treat each other with what's left. If you see the sunrise, think of me. The lines read like whispers from ghosts who refuse to fade. Only 1 in 10 such letters would ever survive censorship. Most were seized, translated, and filed away under non-essential communications. The military called it procedure. The women called it silence. The air inside the tent was thick with the scratch of pencils and the hiss of lanterns. The guards watched but didn't interfere. Maybe they understood the futility of stopping words that had already been born. The letters were folded carefully and tucked inside ration tins, inside sleeves, even sewn into seams. Ico pressed her note flat against her thigh to dry the ink. She wrote one final line. We burned, but we did not scream. It wasn't defiance, it was survival reduced to language. When she looked up, she saw the medic row across the yard, head bent, pretending to take inventory. Their eyes met for half a second, just long enough for him to nod once, as if to promise he'd make sure her words lived longer than she might. Later that night, he slipped near the fence, where she'd been sitting. One folded paper, faintly smudged with soot, lay beside an empty ration tin. He picked it up, heart pounding, and hid it in his pocket. He didn't know it yet, but that single note would follow him through every island left to fight for. 2 nights later, the camp was drenched in rain. It fell in slow, heavy sheets, turning the ash into mud that clung to boots and skin alike. Inside his tent, Ro sat alone, the sound of the storm masking every breath. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out the folded paper, the one he'd found near the fence. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible. We walked through fire. He read it 3 times. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, each stroke a struggle against trembling fingers. This wasn't just a message, it was testimony. Ro didn't know the author's name, but he knew the voice. It belonged to the women, whose screams had been replaced by silence. He smoothed the letter on his knee, tracing the indentations of each word as though they were scars carved into the page. Over 20,000 civilian POW correspondences were intercepted across the Pacific during the war. Most never reached their intended homes. Some were translated, archived, and forgotten. But Ro couldn't forget. The rain outside roared, but inside, the only sound was paper moving softly between his hands. The tent flap opened. Harris entered, soaked to the bone. "What's that?" he asked, voice low but edged. Ro hesitated. A note. I found it, near the fence. Harris stared at the page for a moment, then looked away. Burn it, he said. No good comes from ghosts. Rowe didn't answer. He folded the note again, slower this time, like someone closing a wound. Harris lingered by the flap, the rain streaking down his face, and muttered, "You think they'll ever forgive us?" Rowe shook his head. "I think they already did. That's the part I can't live with." He slipped the letter into the lining of his medical pouch, sealing it between morphine labels and surgical notes. From that night on, he carried it through every island: Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle left new scars on his body, but that paper stayed unburned. In the chaos of men and machines, it was a reminder that somewhere beneath the orders and ash, humanity had whispered once. Someone had heard it. When the war finally ended, Saipan was silent again, but it wasn't peace, only pause. The Americans packed up their tents and drove away, leaving behind mounds of twisted metal and the faint smell of ash buried in the soil. The surviving Japanese women were gathered, photographed for record, and repatriated months later. Many couldn't walk without crutches. Some never walked again. Out of the original 350, reports identified only 78 survivors. By 1940-6.AIKO was among them. Her feet were permanently disfigured, skin melted into scar tissue, toes fused like wax. Photographs, taken by occupation doctors, show her sitting on a wooden crate, face half-shadowed, eyes unfocused. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking somewhere far behind, akin to the memory of heat that never cooled. The American medic, J. Rowe, was reassigned to Okinawa before returning home. He kept the folded letter tucked inside his field kit, the paper yellowing slowly over years. He'd read it sometimes when the world went quiet, when the sound of rain reminded him of that night. "We walked through fire." The words haunted and comforted him, both back in Japan. Post-war newspapers briefly mentioned female survivors from island camps. No names, no stories, only statistics. But memory has a way of refusing to stay buried. Decades later, a historian found a box of old Allied photographs, labeled "Recovered Civilians." Pacific among them was one image of a young woman with bandaged feet and ash. Haraiko, the caption misidentified for as unnamed nurse. For the women who returned home didn't feel like home. Neighbors whispered. Families avoided questions. The empire they'd served had vanished, leaving only silence in its place. Aiko worked in a hospital until her health gave out. She kept her burned shoes in a small wooden box. "To remember what obedience cost," she once said to a fellow nurse. The ash, she believed, never really left their skin. It lived under the scars, beneath the polite smiles in post-war photographs. For every survivor, the island wasn't history, it was still smoldering inside them, waiting for someone to finally listen. And one day, someone would. Decades later, a microphone would click on and an old woman's voice would begin to tremble. Asterisk. It was the early 1980s when the world finally heard her voice. Aiko Nakamura sat beneath a bright studio light in Tokyo, a microphone trembling in front of her. Her hands were thin, veins like faint rivers under paper skin. When the interviewer asked what she remembered most, she didn't start with politics or orders or pain. She started with sound. "The ash," she said softly. "It hissed when we walked." The studio fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. For nearly 40 years, she had carried that memory, burns that never healed, dreams filled with smoke. Her voice wavered, but every word was deliberate, carved from endurance. "We were nurses," she continued. "We were taught to endure. But that day, endurance became something else." She paused, eyes glistening. "We were taught to heal others, not to survive them." There were only 5 documented testimonies from women who endured the Saipan March through burning ash. ICO's was the most complete. She spoke not of revenge, but of memory, the kind that demands to be remembered, even when no one asks. "We walked to live," she said, her tone steady now, "not to hate." Across Japan, newspapers printed her words. Survivors wrote letters to the broadcaster. A few American veterans even reached out. One of them, a retired medic named James Rowe. In a brief note he wrote, "I kept your words all these years. They saved me too." When the interviewer asked if she forgave them, Aiko smiled faintly. "Forgiveness is heavy," she said, "but silence is heavier." Then she leaned forward, voice almost a whisper. "What we carried was not hate, it was the sound of footsteps on burning earth." And that sound had never stopped. Outside the studio, Tokyo buzzed with neon and noise. A city rebuilt atop ghosts. But inside that quiet room, time folded. The war wasn't gone, it was only translated into memory when the recording ended. Aiko bowed her head and murmured something too soft for the microphones to catch. Later, a translator would write it down. Even Ash remembers. Her words, like the letter once folded in a medic's pocket, became proof that humanity can walk through fire and still find a way to speak.